All right, so the title of my talk today is Mad Max in the Modern Music Market, Thriving in the Ruins of the Record Industry. And there's a number of reasons why I titled it so. One of them is I'm a songwriter, so I compulsively alliterate. The other is that I was actually watching this movie, particularly this scene with the dystopian Jimi Hendrix figure playing a pyrotechnic guitar, when the premise for this whole sort of lecture occurred to me. And it's a lecture I typically give during the first 4 weeks of an advanced production project that I oversee as part of the BA in Popular Music Studies program here at Western. And that production project is kind of like a capstone project where students take the instruction in songwriting and record production that they've received, and the whole project culminates in the release, in the commercial release of an original recording, typically. And so this year, for instance, on April 20th, I'll be going to iTunes and I'll be searching for my students' names, and I'll be downloading their tracks and evaluating them by listening exactly as I listen to Pink Floyd or the Beatles or whatnot. Okay, so not to worry, I've reduced it down to about 45 minutes today, and I've tried to make it as interesting for a general listenership as possible. But one thing to keep in mind, I think, is that this is what students now, this is the image of the industry that students who hope to make records are being given right before they enter it. And you'll see that we're in a really interesting place right now where all of the tumult and transformation of the last 20 years in the record industry is starting to settle, I think. So I'll start in an entirely non-controversial place. Most analysts agree that the album as a format is dead, and it died in 2009. And their rationale, well, they give it a lifespan. It began in 1967 with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the subsequent widespread emergence of album-oriented rock. I dated a tiny bit earlier with Harry Nilsson's Pandemonium Shadow Show, if anyone knows it. And they date it roughly 2009 as the year when the format itself reached obsolescence, which is not to say extinction, right? Obsolete and extinct is very different. I still pass many horse-drawn carriages driving up north in the summer, right? But the rationale is that 2009 marked the end of a 10-year decline where physical album sales dropped by 50%. And many of the broadcasting outlets that supported album-oriented rock just stopped doing so. I'm actually going to take it one step further and say I think the record industry is now, as a concept and as a sort of paradigm of behavior and musical communication is now done. And I actually would say that last year was the year when it finally ceased to operate as it typically does. Truth is, we've been watching this happen for a very long time, right? So the last 20 years that I've been in the industry, I've watched this massive decline. In 1999, I was touring, having all kinds of fun, making money, and the physical album sales reached about $14.6 billion that year worldwide. And these figures are from the Recording Industry Association of America. Every year they put out a facts and figures booklet, usually designed to attract investors. So within 10 years, we had this drop of 50%. And it's only gotten worse, though it started to stabilize. Last year, for instance, we hit about $4.9 billion worldwide in record sales, which means that in the last 20-odd years, we've seen a decline of 65% in what was once the preeminent medium. Compounding things, the top 1% of the record industry, so my dad's always quick to say, yeah, but Jay, you know, Ed Sheeran sold 2 million albums last year, you know, why aren't you? And one of the things to keep in mind, though, is that, first of all, we're going to look at how some of those charting numbers are tabulated. It's different now, and they're slightly inflated. Second of all, we've had this intensification of this general trend where you had a sort of upper echelon of artists that would recoup all of the money for the industry. Now we're at a point where this is intensified. It's almost a caricature. The top 1% sellers in the record industry, their sales equal the next 77%. in terms of sales, and we're in this context now that's reduced by 65% from what it was in 1999. So those 2.1 million units that Ed Sheeran ostensibly moved last year, that's equivalent to the next 77% of the industry. So this is clearly an industry that's in decline, or I would say past it. Indeed, in 2015, I'm going to throw a few numbers at you. I think nothing so succinctly nor accurately encapsulates the emotional tenor of working in the record industry as Beaker about to do science. When I finish with this lecture, my students often feel like that, and I say, no, but it's a good thing. Now I'll show you the positives. But there's one number that really made me panic when I saw it. That was 58%. In 2015, kiosk sales of albums dropped by 58% in 1 year. So a kiosk sale is when you walk into a physical environment, you pick up an album and you purchase it, whether that's Walmart or Tower Records. And this, of course, coincided with the closure of Tower, HMV, Sunrise briefly. But I try to impress upon my students that this is not just a number. This means from 1 year to the next, more than half of the world's population decided that it was going to engage in recorded musical communication differently. And that's really important. So, my students gave me this. This is Pollyanna. Many in the industry were very Pollyanna-ish about this. They pointed to something called untethered downloads. Untethered downloads are the downloads where you would go to iTunes and you'd pay 99 cents and you would have that track and you could put it on a USB, you could do whatever you wanted with it. They weren't tethered to a subscription service, right? So if I download a track using Spotify, if I forget to pay the subscription the next month, all my downloads are gone. So that's called a tethered download. Untethered downloads were supposed to save the industry. In 2012, they reached their high point of $3.9 billion worldwide, so they never even quite reached where physical album sales are now. And most analysts, or many analysts I should say, are forecasting sales barely reaching 600 million. And the last 3 years, we've seen a decline in untethered download album sales of roughly 23.4% per year. In fact, in the summer, Spin magazine, Anna Gassa had this to say: the digital download seems poised to join the CD in the format graveyard. I don't think it's poised. You know, some analysts are saying that if the trend continues by 2021, Apple will shutter its iTunes application and there just simply won't be untethered downloads. And so this is the last number I'll throw at you. And this is the only one that really matters, 60%. As you have all this decline, there's been this one industry that's been on the rise, and that's streaming. And in fact, last year, according to the Record Industry Association of America, the record industry generated 60% of its revenue from streaming, right? And I want to argue that streaming is a totally different medium. Streaming is not a new format. This is not like replacing vinyl LPs with audio cassette and then audio cassette with compact disc. And I think the error that many in the industry are making is they're doing the Marshall McLuhan error, which is they're trying to make a new medium do the work of an old medium. Or they're stuck in the rear view mirror. I always like that. This idea that you're driving forwards along the highway, but you're staring in the rear view mirror. And usually it takes some kid in a garage who hasn't been who hasn't been told this is how you should use this medium. And they say, well, this is dumb. Why don't we just do this? Why are you acting as though it's this? So anyways, but 60% of the industry's revenue derived from streaming. And hopefully we'll see, hopefully I'll convince you that that has changed the aesthetic basis of what people do. That the idea of making a record and selling a record and trying to have a mass market hit with a hit song, it's not just not viable, but in fact the vast majority of people who are listening to recorded or who are engaging in recorded musical communication, they're not interested in that. So, there, I worked very hard on this. Out of the demise of the record industry, we see the rise of the streaming industry. And I think that I would date this to 2015 when we had that 1 year drop in kiosk sales, where more than half of the world's population decided, you know what, I'm not going to go into stores. I'm also not going to go online. I'm going to do something different. And in fact, if we take that $4.9 billion worth of revenue generated by record sales last year, and we compare that to the $5 billion that one streaming service alone paid out to labels, publishers, and performance rights organizations last year, we'll see that indeed streaming is the ascendant medium. And numbers support this. As of now, as of the last reporting, more than 100 million subscribers exist for streaming services. The vast majority of them are with Spotify or Apple Music, and Spotify is winning this race. And then the rest are with Deezer, Pandora, Napster, Tidal, and a few others. How many stream? Right on, cool, yeah. I think that slowly over time, this number will rise and rise. Pretty soon, that'll be what people do. But we also have to keep in mind when we look at those numbers that most streaming services operate according to the freemium model, right? Which is a very common business model for multi-sided online platforms. So Apple Music, you can use Apple Music for 3 months, and then they hard upsell you. They say you either get a subscription or you go somewhere else. Spotify, on the other hand, they say, well, why don't we try to monetize the free usage? And they use the typical freemium model, which is advertising, right? One of my favorite things to do is to get my students who think they're going to learn record production, just 1 week, I have them pay attention to all of the free online services they use and then try to figure out how their usage is being leveraged for value, just so they can get a sense of how this is working. Because that's actually the sort of online ecosystem that they're going to try to enter. But in any event, so Spotify allows you to use Spotify in perpetuity. Your usage is encumbered by advertising, so you get 2 or 3 tracks and then an advertisement plays, which is a pain when you're listening to a symphony or something like that. And you can't download so many tracks, and you can't create something called playlists. When you take the freemium users and include them with the paid subscribers, we have 159 million people using Spotify alone. And the churn rate goes down as the number of subscribers go up after the last few years. So people are subscribing and they're staying subscribed, which is to say the trend isn't just some blip like untethered downloading. This seems to indicate that unless something else comes along, people are moving towards this model more and more and more. And so, as producers of music, one of the points to my students is you have to get really familiar with what the priorities and values of this medium are, because they're different than what you were raised with. So I would argue that it's not just physical media that streaming, I don't want to say that it erodes in terms of where the locus of value is. It actually takes aim also at physical media's aesthetic premises, namely the album and the hit song. Now, some people have a hard time when I say this. I'm not saying that people are no longer interested in popular songs. What I mean is the notion of a top 40 packaged, commoditized hit song that is produced, broadcast, and promoted to sell physical units of albums. In fact, now, we typically have as our default mode of communication something called playlists. Now, and this is, I don't know whether you can see this, but the way a playlist works is when you're streaming, you can either subscribe to a playlist. In fact, major labels and streaming services themselves invest a lot of time and money in ensuring that playlists that are algorithmically, linked to your listening preferences are put in your face front and center every time you open up the device. Because the value, they're slowly realizing the value is in the playlist and less in the artist, right? So these are basically mixtapes you create. When you have a streaming service, you have almost the entirety of recorded musical history at your fingertips. You can click on a little drop-down menu, say, add this to my running playlist, add this to my relaxing and reading playlist. Normally these are mood-driven things, or add this to my rock playlist. And it'll keep these things in a separate tab. Less than 7% of the 159 million users on Spotify listen to albums, right? That means the vast majority are listening to playlists and making playlists. Last year, they made over 2 billion playlists. right? This is something that people do when they're streaming. And my favorite little factoid, it just was recently announced, was that as of now, most playlists that have a following of more than 500,000, the metric is 500,000 or 700,000, most playlists that have a following of that or more have more followers, more people subscribing to them than the artists who they feature, right? And many labels actually take differing approaches to playlists and playlisting. And I find it fascinating in terms of where they see value and how they view streaming. So Universal will create a number of playlists, but 100% of the artists featured on those playlists are Universal Music Group artists. So they see the playlist, they see streaming as a content delivery, as sort of a new format or a new packaging, maybe a variation on broadcasting. Whereas Warner Brothers, they have longer lists and they will have less than 60% often on their list being on the Warner roster, which means they see value in the playlist itself. And I often tell my students that we're at this point now where you can use other people's IP or intellectual property to promote and market your own tracks. So rather than investing in an EP, now the paradigm, we'll talk about this, is to put out a single and to work that single as much as possible. And you can actually create a playlist and announce the release via a playlist and have, do research on what are the popular songs that people in your demographic are listening to or in that market are listening to, and create a little EP and have them subscribe to the EP playlist. It's interesting. So there's a great demonstration of this. When the Beatles, a few bands, they were holdouts for streaming, right? Because we'll see streaming, compensation for artists with streaming is pretty dismal. But the Beatles, when they finally released their discography for streaming, when you searched the Beatles and you went to their homepage on Spotify, you didn't see albums. You saw a number of playlists, and you had to scroll down and down and down to get to the albums. And Chris Price, who's at New Slang Media, who I really like, he was a really early sort of canary in the coal mine about this. And he had this to say: if we need a reminder that playlists are fast outpacing albums as the default mode of digital music consumption, and of streaming's pivotal role in bringing that about, then Spotify's demotion below playlists of arguably the most famous album collection in the world would be it. I think there's an even more telling metric. In the first 10 days that Spotify released the Beatles' discography, the most streamed song was Come Together. And this was surprising for people. It's a very popular song, but it wasn't on a soundtrack. And it hadn't been covered by a group in the top 40. They couldn't quite figure out why was it Come Together and not something like Hey Jude, Yesterday, All You Need Is Love, any of those tracks, right? It was a surprise. And the answer, I think, lay in this playlisting where you landed. For the first 10 days, these were the playlists you saw when you searched for the Beatles. And if we go from right to left, one playlist is All You Need Is Love, which is all their love songs. The next one is Twist and Shout, which is their, quote, party playlist. The next one was The Long and Winding Road, which is a really cool playlist, actually. It takes you chronologically through their discography. And then there was Come Together, which was the best of the Beatles, all in the same playlist. And it began with Come Together, right? So in this day and age, in the streaming industry, playlist is king, and it supersedes album and song as the primary locus of value. Again, we're using, I like the McLuhanite distinction, obsolete, not extinct. People are still buying albums, people are still listening to hit songs. It's just that in terms of revenue, this is trending to the point of almost being negligible. Okay, so the Record Industry Association of America put out a package last year and said, this is great, we've solved the problem, we no longer need to fret. Everyone likes Monty Python. I can think of a more apt animation. I'm going to tell you how artists are compensated for streams. And give you so my father, my brother, they love to torment me. They say, oh, it's just the market correcting itself. You don't need a Learjet. And I say, well, first of all, I do need a Learjet. It's important. But something else is going on. From the point of view of people who provide the content, you have to understand these streaming services, they rely on your content completely. You're availing yourself of Spotify's services in order to hear music. We're at a point now where you have to get onto Spotify if you want to be heard. There's a few bands that don't, and I find it interesting. I love having 18 to 22-year-olds primarily in my classes because I can ask, who's heard of this band? And every year there's one less hand going up. But in any event, keep in mind, streaming is not broadcasting. Again, it's a new medium. It's a marble in the new medium jar. So what's happening is we're actually licensing our content for use by these streaming services. So when I go up to an aggregator and I say, I'll pay you money, take my money, put this song on Spotify, Apple Music, all these places, we're effectively signing a license. And it's a non-exclusive license. We're saying, Spotify, you can use this tune. Apple Music, you can use this tune. But you have to pay us a small little licensing fee. And this is how it works. Generally speaking, a streaming service will put aside a percentage of its net revenue for recouping. And recouping is paying monies owed to the artists who provide the IP. Spotify advertises 30%. So we have to keep in mind, first of all, the percentage is variable. It depends on how much money the streaming service made during the accounting period, right? Also, I have it on good authority from someone who's a head of business affairs at a particular label that I'm friendly with, that they will negotiate different percentages of the net revenue for recouping with different labels. So this is how they keep the same scheme, but they alter it so that if a Taylor Swift or someone like that wants to provide access to their discography, they can sort of sweeten the deal, as it were. So Spotify advertises it puts aside 30% of its net revenue for recouping. So if Jay Hodgson Records has a breakout year and we are responsible for 0.003 of Spotify's total streams during the accounting period, that's the percentage of this 30% I'm entitled to. So, to be clear, however many streams you get, that percentage of the recouping percentage Spotify puts aside, you have access to. So, a label only represents clients. So if I'm Jay Hodgson and I have a breakout year and I'm responsible for 60% of Jay Hodgson Music's 0.003% of Spotify's total streams, I'm entitled to 60% of the 0.003% of the 30% net revenue, right? However, filtered through my royalty rates. So let's make this simple. First of all, I spend a whole day on this with my students. We're musicians, not mathematicians. It takes us a while. We have drawings going, pie charts, and then I simplify things for them. Basically, even though some streaming services advertise a rate of $0.006 per stream, the general average is $0.002 per stream. I don't know how to express these numbers. That means, to put that in perspective, you would need to get 2 million streams to recoup the maybe $2,000 that you're going to spend recording drums and vocals to create a rock record that has a shot of generating 2 million spins. 2 million spins is quite a lot. Big stars have 178 million streams in a year, but they're also spending between $500,000 and $2 million to break a new artist and market these things. So, something's got to give, right? So, I'm not an armchair academic. I like to get out there and test these things. So I have all these numbers. I'm lucky enough that my research load entails songwriting, record production, maintaining a position in the actual record industry. So in 2012, when I had my first sabbatical, my wife and I decided it was a perfect time for me to have a controlled midlife crisis, join a band, tour, do all the things that a band does again. And so I actually had a number of recently graduated students who I wanted to see through the first 2 or 3 years because I thought they were immensely talented, and they're actually down in LA right now working, making 100% of their money off of music, which is fantastic. But during this period, I toured with them, I recorded with them, and we put out an album called POACHER, which, fine and upstanding music. It was hard rock. You get to hear a snippet of it shortly. But so every so often with my work, I get a royalty check now, and I have it set out for $50, which at a compensation of $0.002 per stream, I feel like a rock star, you know? But it comes with an accounting of every stream that accounts that makes up the $50. So you get this check, and it's accompanied by a white pages, basically. I'll teach you how to read one for when you drop your hip-hop album. It goes left to right. The accounting occurred May 25th, 2016. The event in question was March 2016. It happened on Spotify. The band name is POACHER. The EP name is Wormwood. The song name was Heroic. There's a yes-no question. The answer was no. I forget what it is. Then it specifies this is a stream, and you're being compensated for one stream. And the compensation for that stream was 0.000896362. I don't know how to express this. How do I say, is it thousands, 10,000s? I don't know. Negligible, that's how I express it. But I'll give you a sense of the track. The track was produced by a gold record, platinum record producer. It was mixed by a multi-platinum record artist who mixes for Drake, among other things. It was mastered by a multiple Juno nominee who's the best mastering engineer in the game. and it has some great bass playing on it. So I'll just play a little snippet of it, just so you can get a sense of it. It is generically limited. That may have been an issue too, but. Another good example, so my dad, my wife, they both say, yeah, but Jay, maybe POACHER just wasn't that popular, and so Spotify doesn't. I say, first of all, we were super popular, just nowhere around here. But second of all, there's other very famous examples. So Meghan Trainor won Grammy for Breakout Artist of the Year off a song, my youngest favorite song, called All About That Bass. She co-wrote it with Kevin Kadish.
Because you know I'm all about that bass, no trouble. I'm all about that bass.
So I'm going to skip the track. It's going to come on quickly, and I'll tell you what's about to come. She received 178 million streams that year, and her compensation from streaming revenue was less than $6,000. It doesn't get bigger than 178 million streams. That's your breakout year. That's the year you plan your retirement.
Because you know I'm all about that bass.
And then, of course, I have that conversation with my dad, who says, well, what about Ed Sheeran, 2 million units? Well, now we're actually using something called album equivalent units to help fluff up the charts. So 10 untethered downloads equals one album, whereas 1,500 song streams equals one album. But keep in mind, at the compensation rate, that means that the industry is now selling albums at $3 a pop. So, those of us who came of age in this, who started with lucrative music. I was given $100 cash every day on my first tour just to buy food. I spent it on CDs. But midway along, you feel like you've awoken in the opening quatrain of Dante's Inferno, right? Like midway along life's journey, the record industry awoke to find itself lost in a deep, dark wood. But I want to suggest that actually once you escape that rear view mirror, there's an unprecedented galaxy of creative opportunity out there. The albums I worked on that got me Juno nominations were with artists living in Berlin at the time. One of them was in Japan at the time. During the Q&A, I hope to be able to show you software that artists use now, and that's an album I mixed for an artist in Nigeria. And I do these things sitting in a recording studio I constructed in Talbot College, sipping my morning coffee, putting my kids off to school, and doing these things that I never would have been able to do before, and my students now are able to do these things too. That just wouldn't have been able to happen because you didn't have the capital to break in. Most people focus on distribution with this. And so artists now are following the so-called long tail model. So we know this model instinctively, I think. There's a head, that's where the mass market lives. That's where you make $1 million overnight. That's where the Bruce Springsteens, the Michael Jacksons, the Madonnas, the Radioheads, that's where they live, right? But then there's also this tail. And that's the niche stuff. That's where you make millions a few pennies at a time. This is actually the general model that most of the platforms that we use to sell music now follows. We'll take a few pennies of that, we'll take a few pennies of that, and we'll just depend on hundreds of millions of you using this. So that's where the Frank Zappas of the world live, right? If you take Overnight Sensation out of his discography, Frank Zappa sold 58 million records at some point and very famously didn't have a single million-selling record. Right? His discography was so large, his fan base so rabid for the niche material he created that it sustained him. So in the head, big investment, big immediate payoff. In the tail, low overhead, low long-term return. This generates a big catalog which allows you to create a larger return. In fact, even major labels now are changing their strategy to follow this long tail model. They have something called playlist carpet bombing. You have your pop release, your single, the Justin Bieber puts out Despacito with other artists, right? Then you have a techno remix emerges, a trap remix, a lounge remix, a downtempo remix, a pop remix. They're very generically specified. A folk remix, if such a thing exists. Then there's all these covers. There's an acoustic version, live acoustic versions, acoustic covers. What's being promoted is the idea that this song is so great that artists can't help but engage with it. And what's actually happening is, sometimes that's the case, but what often happens, this is also part of a general release strategy where these things are being commissioned so that that single song, the IP of the work, can show up on as many playlists as possible. So Spotify now releases a top 50 playlist chart, getting back to playlists, right? And you'll see that many of these playlists are genre-driven. So we have things like indie pop, contemporary, jazz, rock, folk, the things you'd expect. And then some of these are even by era, all out 90s, all out 80s. But then I'm fascinated by these mood playlists. Confidence boost, hanging out and relaxing, piano in the background, soak up the sun, cardio, deep focus, which I listen to while making these slides. My favorite ever is Apple Music. It's got a picture of a rainy window, and it's called Music for Breaking Up To. so I can just imagine you make that phone call, you put on the playlist, don't even have to say a word. And I'm also fascinated by these hybrids that are emerging. So we have genre, indie pop, and then mood, chill out, or folk, and then mood, happy. And I tell my students, be aware of this. Don't call your remix something that makes sense to you and your friends. Call it happy folk. Get noticed. Now there's also a production model that students follow. And I brought the software. I don't want to keep you forever, so we don't have the time right now to go through it. But I can, during the Q&A, if people are interested, I can show you how you use software to create tracks from samples that are made available to you, so your overhead is 0.0 once you've paid for the laptop and the $250 for a software now. You also tend to, when you're working here, you put out your track, you do your best to follow that carpet bombing strategy, and something to keep in mind is most remixes are done for free, and the remixed artist keeps the IP, keeps the publishing on the track. So a lot of the time when someone just wants the streams, or they see it as like a cross-promotional opportunity, so they will remix a track and then they just give it to the artist. So I worked with a label called Thoughtless Music, and two of my Juno nominations came from working with them, and they were this small little group in Toronto, run by Noah Pred, who became so successful that he moved to Berlin, which is the sort of throbbing heart of techno and electronic dance music. And he followed this model. Every month, he would have an artist release one track, sometimes a B-side, and then there would be any number of remixes. This allowed him, at that point in time, we were just before streaming, this allowed him to qualify as an EP, and it happened month by month by month. And that was how, and he lived quite a comfortable life. Anyways, so I'll take you through the production aspects during the Q&A if you're interested. But the upshot of it is that there's an emergence of something called laptop musicianship. And this is what I teach. Many of my classes, when I teach mixing and mastering, which used to be where you would sit in this room that cost $1,800 a day, you can do this now, and it's really just a question of training your ears to hear. I love what Phil Ramone, who produced Billy Joel and many other people, what he had to say. He gave a talk at Art of Record Production in Leeds one time that I went to, and he said, you know, many engineers, many producers sit beside the exact same technology and work with the exact same artists, and everyone produces something completely different. It doesn't really matter what the gear is. What matters is your ears, and you know, your general artistry follows from there. That gear is just there to execute, and it makes a lot of sense. So I've taken that adage and I've boiled it down to laptop musicianship, and I've actually trained people who are working in installed site studios. We've just taught them how to read the technology, how to hear what every knob and dial is supposed to do. So in other words, treating the technology almost as hearing aids that you put on, and I'm going to hear the way the API 550B hears sound. You follow that typical model where you're creating using what these softwares are called workstations, and they're glorified sequencers and samplers, if anyone knows what that is. And it used to be that the typical cost would be $50 for mastering and $10 for distribution, so you just have to, you know, recoup $60 to break even to begin with, and you were churning these things out a lot. This was like your morning routine. Have your coffee, create a track that you could release. $50 was too much, and in fact, they figured out how to automate mastering. I don't think they do a very good job, but most artists avail themselves of that service, so they've taken that out, and so we have $10 for distribution as the general cost for releasing a track now. This is not the major label artists. These are my students breaking into the field, and you know, the vast majority of people who are releasing tracks now, and those who want to thrive in the streaming industry. Then you go to a website. This is CD Baby, for instance, and you upload your tracks, upload your artwork, specify where you'd like to send it. I tested its licensing, whatever the licensing service is. I did a cover of a song called Diamond Day, which very few people know, and it's a kind of obscure song, but it's very popular in folk circles, and I thought, I'll try this. Because when you go to CD Baby, now securing permissions for this is as simple as saying, I would like to pay $5.99 to secure permission. And I thought this will take a while, and it took less than, I think, 5 minutes before I got an email saying, congratulations, you've secured permission. Because everything's automated. And I even tested it, so I went through my white pages of royalties, and I made sure that the money that was owed to the artist went to the artist. So they do everything for you. And this is an example of what we would call disintermediating the supply chain, right? Where all of the sort of middle people are taken out of the equation, right? And that used to be the barrier to success. It used to be a well-known secret for those in the industry. In fact, when I started, that was the case. What kept you from really succeeding was you didn't have access to the distribution mafias that existed and put albums in primary places in record stores. That's all done with now. And the truth is, the promise of this is that you really can occupy the same storefront as the artist you're competing with who has $2 million behind them. And some of my students are actually really starting to succeed with this. And I'll just conclude by going through some of the student successes and imparting a tiny bit of advice that I give to my students, which you might find interesting. One of these, for instance, New Canada, this is a model. And what's interesting is that, again, going back to streaming eroding the album as the primary locus of value, as the default mode, this received a Juno nomination. I was assisted by a student in the program, and it was an EP, a 4-track EP that had no physical release whatsoever. I think I'll destroy the speakers. It was also techno, right? This was even more interesting for me. This was just uploaded to a free online service. It was uploaded, there's something called, does anyone know SoundCloud or Bandcamp? Right, so these were just uploaded to SoundCloud at the time. And then the the two primary artists responsible for it were supposed to tour it, but one of them had a bit of a family tragedy, so he had to go to Vancouver for 8 months. And the other one took that time to have a good time. I lost track with him, and he emerged a year later when we discovered, after having done nothing for it, that it was up for Best Electronic Music Album. I won't torture you with the sonics. I like it, but. And then these are our students. Now my students, it's really nice. My students are starting to actually succeed doing this, following these ideas, following these methods, keeping their overheads low, not paying to act $1,800 a day so they can have a quote-unquote rock star experience in a studio. They're actually working and getting somewhere. Nikki's Wives is a band that these are students that have released. They're looking very forlorn in the picture. I give them a hard time about it. They're generally happy, nerdy kids that I get along with. But they're getting regularly 10 million streams per release. That's significant, right? And this gains the interest then of someone like a Warner. And of course, now they have the bargaining power to say, well, I tell you what, we're interested in your marketing and promotions, but we really don't need you putting us into debt by giving us advances for recording. We've got that covered. Another group, Loud Luxury, that you can see, they're getting 20 million streams, 10 million streams, 8 million streams. I got a text while I was lecturing last week. They're our first alumni to actually somehow manage to go gold in this atmosphere. I was lecturing, I was actually giving a lecture in the class that he was in 5 years or so ago, and he was phoning me to say, hey, I got a gold record, which is really amazing. And then last month I should say, this was a lot of fun. A student project that was done in the little studio that I built in Talbot College actually hit the top 20. And it was so nice to see it nestled there between Pink, Ed Sheeran, Beyonce, and Lady Gaga. So that's pretty exciting. And that is in the untethered download world. So these are very difficult things to do, let alone without having the marketing and promotion muscle behind it. But there are ways of using streaming, and these are students who are embracing streaming and are leaving that marketing, that notion that we have to push albums, we have to push hit songs, and they're saying, well, I'm going to spend my time getting on this playlist, and I'm going to spend my time playing this gig because I know so-and-so who runs that blog is there. So they're working smart and hard. Anyways, and I figure I'll conclude by giving you the final bit of advice I always give my students. This normally takes 4 weeks. Many of them are demoralized, and I always tell them the story. Remember what the Roshi told the hippie, because I love this story. This is Shunryu Suzuki. He was in the 1960s. He was at Tassajara. He was starting a Zen monastery, and of course he was working with koan, which are these sort of Zen stories meant to reveal your mind to you and all that. And a hippie came to him. And he was at wit's end, right? He was, I have to know. He was having that, that great doubt moment. I have to know, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And Suzuki just laughed and said, oh, it doesn't matter. And that's how I like to conclude at the end of the day. It doesn't matter, right? You have to make music. This is the atmosphere you're making music in. You're not going to orchestrate a #1 hit from your bedroom. You have to get out there. You're going to fail. You're going to make mistakes. But the most important thing, the thing I like to take it here as well, is that what you have to kind of set aside is the general authorial ego that drives you to actually do this in the first place. You have to be okay with getting your song on the Happy Folk playlist and on the feeling good about yourself playlist, as well as on the places that you think are cool and that you think speak to your identity as a musician. And don't waste money on what is quickly becoming a resort industry where you go to these installed site studios, you pay all this money, and as someone who works in these studios, I can tell you that the vast majority of that is client management and creating a sort of tourist experience. I will also say it doesn't matter because the wheel's still in spin, and I remind students that when I entered the industry, even though now it seems like there was this great structure and it's just collapsed and is in ruins, when I entered it, it was in tumult and chaos, and it's always been. Yeah, and so get into it and enjoy it. Anyways, so thank you.